Good evening, and welcome to our first program of the new year and new semester. My name is Jake Begard, and I serve as Program Manager of the Common Ground Initiative in the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley State University. On behalf of the Hauenstein Center, Jesse Bernal and Grand Valley State University's Division of Inclusion and Equity, and Bobby Springer and the MLK Committee, thank you for joining us for our annual event commemorating Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Week here at Grand Valley. We'll begin this evening with a leadership minute from a student in our Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy, followed by an introduction of this evening's speaker by Vice President Jesse Bernal. Professor Elijah Anderson will then present his new book, Black and White Space, The Enduring Impact of Color in Everyday Life. Vice President Bernal will then rejoin Elijah for the question and answer portion. So, as questions come to mind, please use the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen to submit them. The theme of this week, commemorating Dr. King, is equity in education. And Publishers Weekly is called Black and White Space, quote, a penetrating ethnographic study and a fine-grained portrait of how systemic racism operates, end quote. But before we hear from Professor Anderson, I'd like to introduce a student striving to create the future both Dr. King and Professor Anderson envision. Annalise Robinson is a first-year student in the Leadership Academy. After graduating this April with her bachelor's in criminal justice, she plans to attend law school. Please help me virtually welcome Annalise.
Hello, my name is Annalise Robinson, and I'm a Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy Fellow candidate. I am a senior at Grand Valley, majoring in criminal justice with a minor in Spanish. Last week, in my capstone class, my professor discussed the Attica prison riot. Many of my classmates had never heard of this incident in which prisoners, who were majority Black, protested the inhumane, demeaning, and racist treatment they experienced inside the prison. Instead of listening to the demands of the prisoners and making changes, New York law enforcement officers threw tear gas and shot at the prisoners, resulting in the bloodiest prison riot in the history of the United States. The Attica prison riot was a horrible incident, but one that must not be forgotten. As people, and leaders especially, we have the responsibility to educate ourselves on the history of our country, not only the good, but also the bad and the ugly. Knowing and understanding our history is how we can learn from the past and improve the future. The presentation you are all attending is in honor of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a brave man who stood against the racist attitudes and segregation in this country. He believed that although those attitudes were present, they did not need to prevail. Instead, Dr. King believed that the spirit of love could defeat attitudes of hatred and violence. The spirit of love would prevail, and that his children would one day attend school, play, live, and work alongside children of all races. His children would have the same opportunities as whites and would not be judged by the color of their skin. One of the leadership competencies of CLA is social responsibility. As leaders, we have the responsibility to educate ourselves on events of the past and present in order to improve all social interactions we have, whether personal or professional. By becoming aware of the implicit biases we all hold, we can push past and defeat the presence of stereotypes and prejudices that are present in this country. My name is Annalise Robinson, and I am a leader.
Thank you, Annalise. It's always great to hear from our students, especially our Cook Leadership Fellows. You're always leading the path in these important conversations. So thanks again. And really good evening and welcome to everyone as well. The Division of Inclusion and Equity is proud to continue our partnership with the Hauenstein Center in tonight's event. Tonight, as Annalise said, is a part of a week-long series of events and activities to commemorate the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at Grand Valley and across Grand Rapids and in Allendale. We began this partnership with the Hauenstein Center in 2017, seeking to engage our campus and community in sometimes challenging conversations about race, racial inequality, and racism and its lasting impact on our nation. Importantly, we hope that these conversations will contribute not only to the dialogue about racial inequity that's occurring in our own community and on our campuses, but really inspire action towards institutional and systemic transformation. Tonight's event is also a demonstration of our commitment to civil discourse. Creating spaces for difficult and sometimes challenging dialogues is at the heart of our liberal arts education, and to advancing a more inclusive campus climate where we can learn from those who may disagree and strive to listen for understanding. We're honored to be joined this evening by Professor Elijah Anderson. Professor Anderson is the Sterling Professor of Sociology and of African American Studies at Yale University. He is one of the leading urban ethnographers in the United States. His publications include Code of the Street, winner of the Komorowski Award from the Eastern Sociological Society, Streetwise, winner of the American Sociological Association's Robert E. Park Award for the best published book in the area of urban sociology, and the classic sociological work, A Place on the Corner. The Cosmopolitan Canopy, Race and Civility in Everyday Life was published in 2011. His latest and most recent ethnographic work, which Jacob mentioned, Black and White Spaces, the Enduring Impact of Color in Everyday Life, was just published this month. It's available now from Chicago University Press and pre-orders on Amazon for delivery later this month. I was just chatting with Dr. Anderson and said that I read the e-text version yesterday and this morning, and it's really an engaging ethnography that blends stories, history, current events, as well as the personal experiences of Professor Anderson to really shape a compelling picture of contemporary racism from individual experiences to systemic challenges that we see today in all of our everyday interactions. Professor Anderson is the recipient of numerous professional awards, most recently the 2021 Stockholm Prize in Criminology, the world's most prestigious award in the field of criminology. Please join me in welcoming Professor Elijah Anderson. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for that introduction. I appreciate that very much. And it's a pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure to be here before you this evening and to speak to you about my work. I'm an ethnographer, and you might wonder what that is, what that means, but ethnography is defined as the systematic study of culture. And culture, for our purposes in ethnography, is a set of shared understandings. And it's the only method really in social science where the scholar puts his body in the field, so to speak. You spend time with real people. You listen to what they say and you watch what they do and you try to make sense of it all. See, that's what we do in ethnography. And the assumption is that people, any community of people, have to go about meeting the demands of everyday life. And as they do so, they come up with understandings and solutions to everyday problems. And they share these problems with people they care about, people they love. This becomes their local knowledge, what they know, you see. And the ethnographer's job is to somehow apprehend and comprehend this local knowledge and then represent it, you see. And you do that by doing field work, qualitative field work among the people, watching what they do and listening to what they say, interrogating them, trying to understand this local knowledge. So what I'm going to present to you today, this evening, and what appears in my book really is an attempt to represent that local knowledge of communities in Philadelphia. This work is based in Philadelphia, based on observation, interviews, history, what have you. And I have lived in various parts of Philadelphia, and I've done field work in these areas of the city, and followed people through these spaces. I've worked in corporations, I've worked on the street, I've worked in communities, I've befriended all kinds of people, Blacks and whites, to get this understanding, this body of work that I've created over the years, beginning in Chicago with A Place on the Corner, where I spent 3 years on one street corner with Black street corner men. That was my PhD thesis. And then I came to Philadelphia and I wrote this book called Streetwise, which was an analysis and ethnography of a changing inner city community. Basically, the gentrifiers were moving in and Black people were moving out oftentimes, but it was all about how people live in that community, called Streetwise. And then I became very concerned about why so many young people in inner city communities were killing each other. And so I began to investigate that issue. And that resulted in the ethnography Code of the Street. And then after that, basically I began looking at Center City, Philadelphia, looking at the various spaces in that city where people come together and basically act real nice across racial, ethnic, gender, sexual preference lines. And that book is called The Cosmopolitan Canopy, an island of racial civility located in a sea of segregation. And from that, I began to look at the Black experience more critically, and this has resulted in the book Black and White Space. So this is work on Philadelphia. This work I'm going to report on tonight is Philadelphia, and it has implications for how we understand other areas of our country. But keep in mind, this is about Philadelphia. So in 1955, when Rosa Parks refused to move from her seat in the white section of a Montgomery bus, that day she started a new day for Black people and for their civil rights. Her actions inspired many others of the Black community, people who then committed themselves to the struggle for first-class citizenship, demanding a better day for themselves and their people. Their actions aided and led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a 26-year-old minister, brought the bus company and the city to its knees and resulted in a major victory for the nascent civil rights movement that ultimately elevated the status of Black people in America. Over the past 50 years, American society has undergone a major racial incorporation process, as large numbers of Black people have left rural areas and urban ghettos and made their way into the wider society, into many areas previously claimed only by white people. Now, during the civil rights movement, Black people and their white allies strongly petitioned the government for civil rights and job opportunities, and as a people grew increasingly insistent and militant. As many of you know and appreciate, the civil rights movement culminated in riots, urban rebellions, and civil disturbances in major cities throughout the nation. In response, the government ultimately passed far-reaching civil rights legislation, especially voting rights. And I'm pointing here to the Voting Rights Bill, Act of 1965, which was so important for Black people. Black people were made to be full citizens under the laws of the land, while the government targeted for reform racially segregated workplaces, local neighborhoods, schools, universities, and cities more generally, which thereby set the stage for the historic period of racial integration and incorporation that has resulted in the subsequent growth of the Black middle class, the largest in American history. However, the wider society's reception of Black people was decidedly mixed. To be sure, many white people encouraged and promoted racial equality and progress, but many others powerfully resisted these changes, which they feared abrogated their own rights and presumed privileges. The civil rights movement is long past, yet segregation persists. The wider society is replete with overwhelmingly white neighborhoods, restaurants, schools, universities, workplaces, associations, churches, towns, courthouses, and cemeteries that reinforces a normative white sensibility in which Black people are typically absent or marginalized. In turn, Black people often perceive such settings and refer to them among themselves as the white space. And they typically approach this space with care. When entering white space, and especially deep white space, or spaces that are completely white, Black people quickly note the proportion of whites to Blacks and may adjust their comfort level accordingly. When judging a setting as too white, they can feel uneasy and consider such spaces to be informally off limits for people like them. For whites, however, the same settings are generally perceived as unremarkable or as normal reflections of civil society. The American city's public spaces and workplaces and neighborhoods may now be thought of essentially as a mosaic of white spaces, Black spaces, and cosmopolitan spaces, or racially diverse islands of civility located in a sea of segregated living that may be in various stages of flux from white to Black or from Black to white. What white people may perceive as diverse, however, Black people may see as homogeneously white. And while the white and Black spaces may appear to be racially homogeneous, typically they can be subclassified in terms of ethnicity. White spaces, for instance, often include not only traditional Americans of European descent, but also recently arrived European immigrants and visitors, as well as others who may be perceived as phenotypically white. Similarly, those inhabiting Black space are not always simply traditional African Americans, but may be subclassified as African, Haitian, Caribbean, Cape Verdean, and so on. And accordingly, the racially mixed urban space, a version of which I've referred to elsewhere, as I mentioned, as the Cosmopolitan Canopy, existing as this island of civility in the sea of segregation. However, as previously mentioned, white people usually avoid Black space, but Black people are required to navigate the white space as a condition of their existence. The Black space. The Black ghetto is no longer simply a physical space. It has become a major icon in American society and culture. And as such, it has become an important source of stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination. This symbol is a function of the present iconography of the city, and it hovers over race relations. And many white people, especially those who are racially insensitive or with limited knowledge about Black people, place and relegate all Black people to the iconic ghetto, which for them symbolizes persistent poverty, social disorganization, violence, and crime. From the days of slavery to the civil rights period, Black people have occupied a lowly caste-like status in American society. And today, despite the progressive changes wrought by the racial incorporation process of the 1960s and 70s and 80s, the color line persists, albeit in new, emergent, but highly symbolic form, to be worked out in the rough and tumble affairs of everyday life. When Black people receive what they know as the inward moment, the moment of acute disrespect based on their Blackness. Now, these moments can be large or small. Black people typically ignore the small ones as so many slights, but the big ones, the big inward moments, are too significant and too consequential to ignore. They are more than slights and can determine whether one gets hired or fired or promoted. They can determine whether one gets a speeding ticket, whether one is stopped and frisked or murdered in the process, as so many Black people succumb these days to the prejudices of white police officers. These moments are no fun for sure, and at times they can be downright traumatic. In my book, I argue that these moments represent the new American color line. In the old days, this line was bold, and Black folks knew the social terrain. They knew their place and taught their children as much. Today, the color line is blurred, and thus, and those who don't know better can touch this third rail of race relations and even get burned, as it were. Today, many more Black people now are highly educated, well-to-do, and reside in exclusive neighborhoods, formerly off limits to people like them, and their children attend formerly white schools. These Black people work in a wider range of occupations than ever, not simply in menial positions, but in professional positions in which Black people have rarely appeared before, including as doctors, lawyers, professors, corporate executives, major elected officials, and as super wealthy celebrities. And they often reside in upscale and formerly all white neighborhoods. But as Black people become increasingly more visible throughout society, the dilemmas and contradictions of status have also become more common. The physical and institutional Black ghetto persists. And as such, it conditions many Americans, and maybe especially low information white people, to think that the Black person's place is most often in the ghetto hood and not in middle class, white dominated society. Thus, whites and others often associate Black individuals with the iconic ghetto and symbolically place them there, burdening them with a deficit of credibility that on occasion manifests in acts of acute disrespect reminiscent of America's racial past. Again, the end moment is what I'm talking about here. That's what Black people call it. And they say this to themselves. They tell about their nigger moments to other people, you know. Among themselves, Black people call such incidents, and I would again, I say, in the inward moment. And generally they interpret them as deeply racist attempts to put them back in their place. And these moments of acute disrespect based on Blackness and the Black ghetto as a concrete point of reference constitute the present day American color line. Again, in the old days of Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, and W.B. Du Bois, this caste line was bold and clearly marked. Today, it has become blurred and is often ignored until this inward moment occurs, you see. This is what I found in my work. The white space, when the anonymous Black person enters the white space, others there immediately try to make sense of him or her, to figure out who that is, or to gain a sense of the nature of the person's business and whether they need to be concerned. In the absence of routine social contact with Black people, stereotypes emanating from the iconic ghetto often rule white perceptions, placing almost any unknown Black person, especially a young male, at a social distance. The anonymous Black person is immediately burdened with a deficit of credibility and symbolically relegated to the iconic ghetto with all its pejorative connotations. Most often, he or she signifies trouble, and security may be summoned. Now, such stereotypes persist, not because of the individual's merit as a person, but his or her Blackness and what it has come to mean in the white space, a deficit of credibility. Strikingly, this deficit may be minimized or possibly overcome by a performance of what some Black people derisively refer to as a dance, through which individual Black people are required to show that the ghetto stereotypes do not apply to them. The performance can be as deliberate as dressing well and speaking in an educated way, or as simple as producing an ID or driver's license in situations where that would never be demanded of white people. Depending on how well the Black person performs and how this performance is received, he or she may pass inspection and be provisionally accepted in the white space. But others there may require additional proof on demand. In the workplace, from the janitor to a middle-level manager, Until they have established themselves, Black persons live under the tyranny of the command performance. And the string of and the string of people standing in line to witness the performance or the dance may cause those who were once convinced to demand an encore. Thus, so as long as the Black person is present in the white space, he or she is likely to be on, performing before a distant and highly judgmental audience. Distant because of the racial divide, and judgmental because of the threat the Black person may be assumed to pose to the white space or to those whites standing in judgment. Moreover, while present in the white space, the anonymous Black person is typically burdened with a negative presumption that he or she must disprove before being able to establish mutually trusting relationships with others. A presumption that is often hard, if not impossible, to overcome. Strikingly, while navigating the white space, the Black person expects to meet at least three kinds of white people: those who mean him well, or those who do not, and a wide swath of white people inclined to tolerate them with little or no racial animus, but who show almost no interest in knowing them. With social antennae on high alert, the Black person's challenge is to figure out the kind of white person he or she is dealing with, and then to take evasive action if necessary, or to dissemble, a situation that encourages the Black person to remain guarded in the presence of white people he or she does not know well. Often Black people place anonymous whites as adversaries until they pass inspection. However, that more Black people can negotiate their status in the white space through a performance signifies how much American society has changed since slavery and the caste-like system of state-enforced racial segregation. In the aftermath of the shooting of Florida teenager Trayvon Martin in 2012, a handful of reporters and columnists and many members of the general public made the obvious comparison with the death in 1955 of Emmett Till, a Black Chicago teenager visiting Mississippi, killed by a group of whites who believed he had flirted with a white woman. And while that comparison has merit, these murders must be understood as a result of very different strains of racial tension in America. The racism that led to Till's death was embedded in a virulent ideology of white racial superiority born out of slavery and the Jim Crow codes, particularly in the Deep South. That sort of racism hinges on the idea that Blacks are an inherently inferior race, a morally null group that deserves both the subjugation and poverty they get. Today, racism has become more highly symbolic and more nuanced, more textured than anything America has seen before, and usually does not always manifest in overtly hateful or violent acts. Instead, it manifests in a pervasive attitude that all Black people start from the inner city ghetto, and therefore the ghetto icon, especially its supposed immorality, danger, crime, and poverty, stigmatizes them. Often the Black people encounter in white spaces don't think much of them. The racial hatred may materialize when the Black people demand equality or when they get too close, quote unquote. The most easily tolerated Black person in white space appears to be one who has passed inspection or is in their place. That is, one who is working as a janitor or a service person, or is one who has been vouched for by white people in good standing. Such a Black person is less likely to disturb the implicit racial order, whites as dominant and Blacks as subordinate. However, when the Black person appears or operates in roles above his or her assumed low station, onlookers of any color may perceive the situation with dissonance, amusement, or even with pleasant surprise. But not everyone is pleasantly surprised by the presence of Black people in high places. Some white people are outraged and seek to put the Black person back in his or her place, quote unquote. This is when racial harassment occurs and when the term N-word is often voiced. In the white space, the Black person is subject to being called or treated as an N-word at any moment. This tells the Black person he or she does not belong. As one Black person told me after experiencing such a moment, once it happens to you, all bets are off, and one does not know what to expect. No matter what you thought of yourself, for the moment, you don't know just where you stand. One feels like a stranger in a strange land. Any white person present in the white space can possess and wield this enormous power. But the whites who feel marginalized by Black presence may feel most compelled to wield it. For many of them, Blacks in the white space become a profound racial symbol, the personification of their own travail, their own inequality, and they can feel put down by the spectacle of Black advancement. While not all but white people are guilty of this act, white people are congealed in the complicity of the white space that Blacks navigate as a condition of their existence, where whites belong and where Black people can so easily be reminded that they do not. Usually taking this state of affairs for granted, Black people approach the white space ambivalently, or even largely for instrumental reasons. When possible, they may avoid it altogether or leave it as soon as possible. In exiting the white space, however, the Black individual can feel both relief and regret. Relief for getting out of a stressful environment and regret for perhaps leaving prematurely. For the white space is where the social rewards originate: an elegant night on the town, education, employment, privilege, prestige, money, and the promise of acceptance. To obtain these rewards, Black people must venture into the white space and explore its possibilities, engaging it to the extent that they can, and then hoping to benefit as much as possible. To be at all successful, they must navigate the white space and manage themselves within it. But the promise of acceptance is too often only that, a promise. There are always prejudiced people in the white space who are ready and willing and able to marginalize the Black person, to remind her of her outsider status, or to put him in his place. Ralph's experience is germane. Ralph is a Black 18-year-old I met, a person who grew up in a nearly all-white upper middle class neighborhood and has attended private schools in a wealthy section of Philadelphia for his entire life. His parents are well off and pay Ralph's full tuition themselves. A student of good character who makes excellent grades, Ralph is one of the few Black students in his school. He is also a member of the soccer team. When his team plays various elite schools, high schools in the Philadelphia suburbs, he is usually the only Black player on the field, and he plays the game well. During these games, Ralph is occasionally called the N-word, but such outbursts usually come from spectators. But recently, when he was playing in an away game, the epithet came from an opposing player. As the clock wound down and his team seemed destined to win, tensions grew between the opposing teams. Then one of the players on Ralph's team was apparently fouled up the field, and Ralph called this to the attention of the referee, to which one of the opposing players retorted, "What are you going to do about it? N-word." He yelled his remarks directly at Ralph, quite loudly and within earshot of the coaches, the referee, and the spectators, including his mom, the only Black spectator attending the game. When Ralph heard this epithet directed at him, he said he simply didn't know what to do, how to react. And everyone focused on me. I never felt so alone in my life. My head was about to explode, he told me. And I just pushed the guy. This is the opposing player. At this point, the referee approached to address Ralph's push. And Ralph said to him, "Did you hear that? Did you hear that? He just called me the N-word." The referee just shrugged. Then in front of the referee, the opposing player yelled at Ralph, "So what? Yeah, I said it, and I'll say it again." The referee and the coaches, all of whom had witnessed this exchange, appeared to ignore the white player's comments. The situation was confused. The other spectators, made up largely of school parents, teachers, and classmates, looked on impassively, though a few of them hissed and booed at Ralph. And he felt uneasy and very alone, not knowing where he stood with his teammates. Ralph's mom felt deeply disturbed and humiliated, but mostly she felt sad for her son. After the game, when the tension died down, the opposing player singled out Ralph's mom, approached her, and addressed her. "Your son was in the wrong, you know. He never should have been so close to me." Then Ralph told me, "I'm glad I didn't see that." That is the opposing player approaching his mom. But the coaches suspended the post-game ritual of meeting and handshake between the opposing sides. With the confusion, not everyone understood exactly what had transpired during the game. They only knew there had been unusual tension and that Ralph had been involved. But even though they failed to know what the trouble was, the attendees all seemed to blame the incident on Ralph, he said. Later, one of Ralph's mother's acquaintances acknowledged that she had gathered that there was some sort of trouble that Ralph had been involved with. And she now suggested that Ralph not ride back on the team bus, that his mother should drive Ralph home separately from his teammates. His mother refused. In conclusion, because of slavery and years of Jim Crow segregation, or essentially American apartheid, Black people are burdened with a persistent deficit of credibility that is very hard to shake. And as Black people navigate white space, they typically incur random disrespect and unfair treatment. And these are things that many white people have no idea about because they don't have Black skin. But as a Black person moving about, there are these challenges every day that come out of the blue. And they've come to expect this in white space. And when they don't receive it, they are pleasantly surprised. For Black people, the white space and the people who occupy and control that space constitute a major problem in their everyday lives. And because of this, Black people approach the white space and the white people there carefully. In the white space, white people, in comparison to their Black counterparts, have an implicit social power that is backed up by a peculiar moral authority that Black people lack. And of course, by the same token, for Black people, credibility is highly precarious. Thus, in this space, Black people are required to manage themselves. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Anderson. Appreciate your insights and also the stories that you told that led up to your most recent book, Black and White Space. But I want to start, what I want to do first is encourage the folks in the audience, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your Zoom box and feel free to type in some questions and we'll get to as many as we can. But Professor Anderson, wanted to start with, before you started talking, we were talking about the role of an ethnographer, particularly around topics that can make people uncomfortable, like race and racism and the Black experience. And you were telling me that what you do as an ethnographer is not an ideological or political argument, but really is sharing your observations about realities that you're experiencing. Can you share more about that as folks kind of soak in what you've just shared?
Sure, and I've talked to many people in Philadelphia, Black people, white people, Asian people, Jewish people, all kinds of people. In doing this kind of work, you spend time with real people, and you, as I say, you listen to what they say, and you watch what what they do. And you do this in terms of social observation. It's not always a matter of interviewing, you see. You observe and you write field notes. And from these copious field notes, you make sense, and then you try to get a sense of that local knowledge. That is what people hold as they move about with their presuppositional frames. You do field work, you do qualitative field work. And so this analysis is really a kind of set of findings. It's not even what the ethnographer prefers or doesn't prefer. It's what makes sense given the observations he or she has been able to make, if you follow me. Yep. And this work, this present work, Black and White Space, is not simply based on a few years. It's based on kind of a lifetime of observing social life in Philadelphia and other places around the country. You see, but it focuses on Philadelphia. And this is what I've been able to come to. Now, we've come a long way in this country racially, believe me, a long way, but we have so far to go. And the idea here is, at least from my perspective, to represent it, to tell it, to put it out there, hopefully to edify people and have people raise questions and try to do better.
Thank you for that. You know, much of your book talks about the Black experience in particular, and you talk about sort of this cycle or this powerful loop that, you know, Black and white people play in the U.S. context, where these iconic ghettos are created because of slavery and segregation, but also creates this cycle of poverty and unemployment that then confirms some of the historical white perceptions of Black people, and that therefore allows Black people to justify their thinking around or stereotyping around Black experiences within our communities. And that's all generalized, right, as you mentioned in your book. But what role do you think white people play in disrupting that cycle, in sort of shifting away from what you call sort of the intractable racism that exists as part of the U.S. history context?
Yeah, it's a very complicated set of issues, really. One of the contributions of this book is the concept of the iconic ghetto. The iconic ghetto is no longer just a physical space. It's become an icon. I mean, slavery as an institution established the Black body at the bottom of the order. And after slavery, Black people migrated to cities of the South and of the North, and were oftentimes told to keep going, you know. And they settled in some of these places on the outskirts of town, and other Black people joined them. And pretty soon you had a Black community. And it was referred to in so many of these places as the place where the Black folk live. Well, these places were the precursors of the ghetto, so to speak. And this setting reinforced this notion of white over Black, which slavery established, if you follow. And of course, you know, so many white people of that town, or this town, or that town, or of the country, became invested, socially invested in the lowly place of Black people, and the notion that that's where the Black folk live. Well, over time, these places grew and became ghettos. And ultimately, we had the civil rights movement, as I suggested in the beginning of this talk. And that civil rights movement, led by Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and people like that, I mean, that movement basically was very, very, very important for elevating the status of Black people. But as you all know, this movement culminated in riots and civil disturbances and political rebellions around the country, you see. And at the same time that this was going on, we had a Cold War. We had this country competing with the Soviet Union for leadership of the world. And at the same time, we had so many developing countries becoming newly independent, and they were looking for leadership, which way to go, whether to follow the Soviets or to follow the West. And so the powers that be in this country, right at that point, began to push for incorporation. You see, we didn't look very good because Black people at that time couldn't even vote. And many of these countries that were becoming newly independent were looking for leadership from either the West or the Soviets. And we didn't look very good because Black people were such a lowly caste. And so I think that this problem, this issue, encouraged so many politicians and economic dominance to push for integration and incorporation of Black people into the system. And so this led to the largest Black middle class in American history and a lot of changes in the way we did things racially in this country. So today we have the largest Black middle class in American history as a result of this incorporation process. And yet the ghetto remains, you see, buffeted by the winds of deindustrialization, the global economy, because as jobs leave the inner cities, in this country, they go to Mexico, they go to China, they go to Vietnam, they go to various third world countries. And people working in these countries effectively compete with our poor people here. And to the extent that they do, the standard of living in those places, these ghettos, these inner city areas goes down, you see. And this has been going on. And the term that we social scientists use to describe this is structural poverty. You see, and this affects not only the poor and the working class, but increasingly the middle class as well, you see. And all this is going on. But at the same time, the Black community can be divided into people who live in the ghetto and those who live in the largest society, again, because of the incorporation process, fair housing, and a whole host of civil rights laws that basically helped the Black community expand and to move into the largest society. And yet, the people who have been able to move into the larger society are still Black. And a lot of people who don't know any better confuse these people with people who live in the ghetto. So even though you may be middle class, you may be a doctor, you may be a lawyer, you may be a professor, as long as you have Black phenotype, there are some white people who will associate you with the hood. And so this deficit of credibility. At the same time, I must say that that these changes that went on were really, not possible without the support of white people. And so over the years, many white people have been very, very supportive of these changes, if you follow me. At the same time, there were poor whites who felt that their own rights were being abrogated by the inclusion of Black people, and they resisted these changes, if you will. Over the years, this group that felt that their own rights were being abrogated by the inclusion of Black people, this group has grown, you see. They've grown in number and in political influence. And I might say, I dare say that part of the issues that we face right now with the Republican Party and others, getting rid of the vote, ready to corrupt our political system to some extent. This is related to these changes that have been made. And there's a peculiar kind of browning of America that some white people are very afraid of, if you follow me. So it's complicated what I'm saying. But the iconic ghetto is really important here because that's the place, quote unquote, where the Black people live. But it's no longer just a physical space anymore. It's become iconic, you see. And so what that means is that it becomes this really major source of stereotype and prejudice and discrimination, you see. When you walk down the street as a Black person, a lot of people associate you with that ghetto long before they associate you with a middle-class white space, if you will. And this can be the policeman, it can be the professor, it can be the doctor in the emergency room, it can be an employer, you see. And so the Black person, because of this dynamic, moves about with this deficit of credibility until he or she can disabuse people of the idea that their ghetto stereotypes apply to him or her. And this puts in motion this kind of a dance that some Black people resent, if you follow me.
Thank you for so thinking about sort of the role that white communities have in really shifting and transforming our society around its racist behaviors or racial sort of socialization. So we talked a little bit about Grand Valley State University being a predominantly white institution. One of our guests, our viewers, asked, how do universities like Grand Valley that are predominantly white institutions create, so kind of twofold, create more inclusive spaces for our Black faculty, staff, and students, and what role do we have in educating our students and faculty and staff who are not Black to be supportive of some of the movements that we have around civil rights and inclusion for people of color?
I think it's important to show people, to teach people that they have more in common with other people who seem so different superficially. They have more in common with them than they know, if you will. In essence, what we're talking about is education here. I think people need to be educated about the fact that we're all in this together, and that, and as Martin Luther King said so powerfully, that we must judge people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I think that's really, really important to do. And yet so many people, as I say, because of the iconic ghetto, so to speak, which complicates so much, I mean, they're ready to associate all Black people with that space. I mean, to weaponize their prejudices and put people in that place, if you will. And this is like a really tough situation you can imagine for the Black college student, for the Black lawyer, the Black doctor, the Black professor, what have you, you see, because of the association with this space. And this is not to put people of the ghetto down, but it's just the dynamic is complicated because of the ways in which people are associated with space in our society. The iconography of the city also has implications for how people are regarded, if you will.
Thank you. So you mentioned in your one of your responses that as an ethnographer, you participate in your own research in a lot of ways. So one of the viewers is asking if you're willing, and I knew you share a number of these stories in your book, if you're willing to share any of your personal experiences of navigating in white spaces, where there are positive moments, of course, where there are challenging moments, that helped you reflect on how you're sharing this story in Black and white spaces.
Absolutely, absolutely. In the beginning of the book, I talk about my own background. I was born in the Mississippi Delta on what used to be a plantation, and my grandmother was the midwife when I was born. And my folks during the war, my dad, my mom and dad, they all went to the cotton field. They all picked cotton, But after the war, my dad could see that he couldn't live in the South anymore. He'd been overseas. He'd been treated like a full human being. He just didn't want that anymore. And the North beckoned, and he and my mom and I, we made our migration to South Bend. He got a job at Studebakers in the foundry. He had a 4th grade education, and I was raised in South Bend there. And with respect to my own upbringing, and this is like laid out in the very beginning of the book, I talk about this trek to South Bend. I talk about my own childhood there. And one story that I don't put in the book, but is so essential, is the experience of my mother when she worked as a cleaning lady in an appliance store on the outskirts of South Bend, and she was the only Black person there. And she would dust the appliances and mop the floor and make the coffee. And she got on very well with all these people, the white salesman and the owner and all that. And one day she had this bright idea, because she didn't see Black people coming and buying things in the store. And she had this idea that she could have her church people come. She was an usher in the church and very popular. And she felt that she could, after the day, because the store was open till 9 at night, and so she figured that between 5:30 and 9, she could be a sales lady, kind of thing, and her friends could come in and buy appliances because they like TVs, they like washing machines, they like all these things, And so she approached the owner, and he thought it was a great idea, and so. Next thing I know, as a 13-year-old, my mom is having these cards made up, and she's going to be a sales lady and all that. And she was so proud of herself. And she did, and she distributed the cards, and her people began to come out to the place and buy TVs and buy appliances. And the owner, who was a very liberal person, was very pleased with this until the white salesman began to complain, so to speak, and eventually he called my mother in and had a talk with her, and she looked at him. She was very candid in her, very frank, and she told him, said, "John, I didn't know you were like that." Like what? Well, she said, prejudice. I'm not, it's the salesman. And, anyway, the upshot of it all is that she had to stop. And she was really deflated by this whole experience. I was 13 years old. I could see everything right there. I heard the whole story, but it's the classic in moment, this moment of acute disrespect that is so powerful, and it's the new color line, so to speak, and it's a very powerful thing. But she had to not be a sales lady anymore, and she had been such a spirit, such a lively spirit around the place, and she'd laugh at the jokes and talk about what was on TV last night and this kind of thing, that kind of thing. But after this happened, she could no longer laugh at their jokes. She could no longer feel the same feeling that she had before. And in about 3 weeks, she quit. She quit. She couldn't be there anymore. I say this because this is the kind of thing. This is the classic in moment, that moment of acute disrespect that you feel. And these can be small, but they can be big. The small ones, Black people, especially the middle class, they deal with, they don't, you can't just freak out over every little thing that happens to you. And so they put up with it, they deal with it, but the big ones are more consequential. The big ones are traumatic sometimes. The big ones can make you change your job. The big ones can get you fired. The big ones can get you written up. The big ones can get you killed by the police, you see. And this in moment is the new American color line, you see. And it's not as bold as it was, say, 50, 60, 70 years ago. Today, it's blurred because of all the positive changes that we've gone through, but you can always hit that third rail of race relations and be electrocuted, if you will, So that's kind of a personal experience that I've had. But again, this is not in the book, but this is something that a lot of Black people, experience, and they share these end moments with their friends. They share these end moments with everybody except white people. The white people don't know about the end moment, you see, but every Black person knows about the end moment, this moment of acute disrespect based on your Blackness. And this causes Black people to give the talk to their sons, give the talk to their daughters, to warn them about white people, kind of thing, because white people can change up and become hostile so quickly, kind of thing. Again, there are good white people. There are people who are racist in the mindset of Black people. The problem is knowing which is which, you see. And as I said in my presentation, and this comes out in the analysis and comes out in the interviews I did, when Black people move through white space, they expect to meet 3 kinds of white people. White people who mean them well, and there are plenty of those who do, but also there are white people who don't mean them well, and the antenna are on high alert to figure out who is who, which is which, you see. And the third type of white person is the white person who has no racial animus. He or she is just simply tolerant, and this is probably most white people, but they're not really interested necessarily in really getting to know the Black people, and Black people can feel this and see this and basically generalize sometimes, if you will. But this is all in the study. This is all in the book. This way of navigating white space is all in the book from the point of view of an ethnographer, as it were.
Right. Well, Dr. Anderson, we're out of time for questions. I want to thank folks who have submitted questions. What I would encourage you, lots of your questions are answered in Dr. Anderson's most recent book. So please go out and get that. It's called Black and White Space. And it will, Scott, to your question, as an educator, it will share some examples about how you can understand how Black students may navigate white spaces. So I do encourage you to read it. It's an interesting read that Dr. Anderson shares a lot of his stories and experiences, and also, as I mentioned, weaves in history and some of the systemic issues that we see plaguing our society today. So Dr. Anderson, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Jacob.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Anderson and Vice President Bernal, for that thought-provoking and engaging discussion. I would echo Vice President Bernal's call to go out and purchase your book. After this meeting ends, a link will pop open with a survey for this evening's event. Please fill that out and let us know what you thought of the program, and give us feedback for future events as well. Nominations and applications for the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy are open and will close on February 28th. You can find more information on the Hauenstein Center website at gvsu.edu/HC. And don't forget to join us on Friday, February 11th at 4 p.m. when Gracie Harkema joins our Leadership Academy cohort to share her lessons in personal and professional leadership. Once again, thank you all for joining us this evening. Have a good night.